Hello, I'm David Hartwell, and I'd like to discuss today how we address the problem of misinformation in the United States. I'm presenting this as a student in Eastern University's data science capstone class, which is ethical and philosophical issues in data science. And I'd like to start with two stories. In November of 2016, news erupted regarding social media posts that Hillary Clinton was holding children hostage in the basement of a pizza shop as sex slaves for the purposes of satanic rituals. According to Wikipedia, it started as a Reddit post that was quickly picked up and amplified by alt-right activists, dubious news websites, Twitter, and eventually Facebook. By the end of the month, the pizza shop owners and employees were receiving hundreds of threats of violence. The police and politicians were receiving outraged demands for action from honest citizens. The story takes a sad turn when a 28-year-old father of two, Edgar Welch, takes various semi-automatic weapons and attacks the store under business hours, only to discover that it was in fact a ruse. For his mistake, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison, and it made him the poster child of how people can be duped by misinformation and the harm it can do. Let's jump forward 3 years to another story, which is very different, and then I'll explain why I chose these two. In December of 2019, hospitals in China's Wuhan province started to report a handful of patients that were experiencing pneumonia-like symptoms that did not respond well to the usual treatments. Of course, this was the first reports of coronavirus, what we call COVID-19. As we know, the virus quickly spread around the globe, and according to the CDC, in February, 2 months after the initial report, there was 100,000 cases and 3,000 deaths. And a month after that, there was over 1 million cases and 75,000 deaths. The devastation of this virus is truly unimaginable. So these stories are connected in three ways. First, mathematically, the growth rate of COVID is exponential, as is the number of misinformation repostings, like the fake Pizzagate news. Second is that misinformation, like pandemics, often have severe consequences. And third is that the current approaches towards how we prevent the spread of disease is similar to how we can prevent the spread of misinformation. And this is my point. Misinformation often has severe social consequences, and the spread of misinformation is similar to the spread of communicable diseases. And the word for this is infodemic. The World Health Organization webpage says an infodemic is, quote, too much information, including false or misleading information, in digital and physical environments that causes confusion and risk-taking behaviors that can harm health. Wikipedia defines the word in a more general sense. It says that infodemic applies not just to health, for instance, COVID, but extends to any form of misinformation. Political, the Clinton pizza parlor scandal, or anti-science type posts where global warming is a myth, or flat earth society posts, and on and on. Adopting an infodemic mindset requires we shift our thinking from simply blaming technology to one of recognizing that it's inevitable and malevolent and needs to be suppressed. In my research, I found similarities in how we fight misinformation to that of viruses. First, by stopping misinformation before it can spread. Second, for misinformation that does get out, suppressing the spread of that misinformation. Third, identifying and labeling misinformation when it's found. Next is providing user tools that can be trusted and believed. And finally, we have to inoculate our population and build up a herd immunity where we can get sufficiently large enough population to recognize and reject misinformation when we see it. Obviously, stop it before it can spread is a great place to start. In 2016, Ebola broke out in Western Africa. Serious concerns was that the disease would spread worldwide. In the end, the virus was contained and brought to a close, but not before 11,300 something people died. When it flared up again 5 years later in 2021, The World Health Organization was watching for outbreaks, and it was stopped before it could spread. As a result, only 11 people died. The success of fighting the 2021 outbreak was that because people knew what they were to be looking for, and they knew how to stop it. The problem of stopping something that spreads exponentially before it starts is that it's like looking for a needle in a haystack when you don't know what the needle is going to look like. We all know what exponential growth looks like. For instance, if we have a virus that on average infects 3 new people for every infected person, this progression is the sum of 3 to the power of n-1. In other words, the first person infects 3 people and they're 4. Those 3 people infect 9, then you have 13 people infected. And in the next round, you have 27, then 40 people infected, then 125, 360, 1,000, 3,000, 10,000, 30,000, 88, 265,000, 800 people, which jumps to over 2 million people. While it's easy to identify that something is growing exponentially after a few iterations, the problem is that by then, something has grown very large and will only get much worse very fast. When we're talking about millions of social media posts a day, looking for and stopping those bad posts that are going to grow exponentially is only ever going to be somewhat successful. And another problem is that often this misinformation posts are started by super spreaders. Sites like Breitbart News, TV personalities like Tucker Carlson, or tweet influencers like Donald Trump. When a super spreader influencer spreads misinformation, the cat's out of the bag. The race is on. We need to move on to other tools in our infodemic fighters tool bag and figure out ways to suppress the post. To suppress the spread of misinformation, we first need to understand the basic models of how this stuff grows. A number of teams like the Stanford Engineering Group have built tools that analyze the spread of fake news using mathematical models that are similar to the models of how Ebola spreads. The models are a bit complex, but at a high level, the common variables are R sub 0, the basic reproduction ratio. This is how much does this thing replicate? If it has an R which is less than 1, it'll die out because it didn't spread fast enough. And if R is greater than 1, it will spread and spread relatively fast based on how large that is. The next 3, SIR, are susceptible, infected, and recovered. Susceptible, in the case of misinformation, are people who may be less well-educated or less tech-savvy, and most often, people with strong beliefs. This latter point is due to what's known as confirmation bias, the tendency to believe information that reinforces our own personal convictions. If I believe something and you send me a mail that tells me something that jives with what I believe, I'm likely to believe that piece of information. Whereas if you send something to me which conflicts with what I believe and my personal convictions, I'm less likely to believe it. For infected and recovered, in the case of misinformation, those who receive and believe something and are willing to share it with others without checking its veracity versus recovered would be people who have learned to question and confirm the truthfulness of a post before forwarding it. And we'll talk about this in a moment. The last big variable in this section is called multiple exposures. Misinformation is similar to virology in that often the more exposure someone gets, the more likely the disease will take hold or the misinformation is going to be believed. The spread of QAnon is an example where people hear something outrageous, so they go and they Google it. They found lots of examples and results on their Google results. So they read up on what it is that's coming back to their Google, and they become convinced that it's the truth. And this is what happened to poor Edgar Welsh with Pizzagate. Modeling the spread of misinformation in social media has some unique aspects. For instance, as I discussed a moment ago, the power law, where influencers early on can cause a huge jump in visibility and believability of a post. Also unique to the spread of misinformation are bots and trolls, as well as the work of front groups that create the appearance of truthfulness regardless of what the actual facts are. We should expect and demand that misinformation be found, identified, and labeled. So Facebook, for instance, has been tagging certain posts, pages, and groups to help people understand that what they're seeing is potentially fake information. There are some challenges to this, of course. For instance, often misinformation is sandwiched with true information around it to make it more plausible. For example, a political speech where the speaker underscores the accomplishments of their administration and the great harm and evil of the other political party. Now, an emerging risk in this area is the ability for bad actors to use AI to create deepfake videos and news articles. In this area, we're likely to need technical solutions to supplement human efforts to make and prove something was likely manufactured. But the key here is that to be accepted, these labels must have the ability to speak authoritatively that something is either true or false. One more time. As an example of an authoritative test, consider the COVID home test. While there are some fringe groups that say the test kits shouldn't be used, the consensus is that the test is generally reliable and can be trusted to indicate if you have COVID or not. In part, the lack of controversy around these tests is that they're simple and they're standardized. One line, you're not infected. 2 lines, you have COVID. Unfortunately, misinformation fact checkers are not simple or standardized. And as a result, let me put this nicely, they're subject to some skepticism. Some organizations like Snopes.com and Wikipedia have managed to establish a relatively high level of faith in their reviews, while some, like PolitiFact, have been centers of disagreements as to their veracity, one way or another, and others, like Fox and CNN, regularly release fact checks that everyone just assumes are biased towards their political base that they're pandering to. What some researchers have proposed is that we need a certification standard for fact-checking that is simple and generally reliable. They propose we, quote, fact-check the fact-checkers and certify that they are following a standard. An interesting model is the European Fact-Checking Standard Network, EFCSN. The EFCSN model is that there's a code of standards in how we check, rate, and label facts, and this fact labeling is overseen by a governance body which reviews and enforces compliance. Of course, there'll always be some who reject any governance. QAnon groups, for instance, are never going to buy into a tool that regularly flags their information as pants on fire, bat shooting crazy. But it's been pointed out that Americans generally understand and accept the need for standards, for instance, with food and nutrition labels, the Surgeon General warnings on labels of cigarettes, the speed limits that we have, and seatbelt laws. But with this, let's move on to how we might inoculate our citizens and build a herd immunity. An article by Gordon Pennycooks in the 2021 Nature magazine titled "Shifting Attention to Accuracy Can Reduce Misinformation Online." It describes the results from a study where people were asked to judge the veracity of a news article, and afterwards those people were significantly less, quote, significantly less likely to consider sharing false headlines compared to the control group, and they were equally likely to consider sharing true headlines. This triggered in me an aha moment. This is how you can inoculate a population. Imagine that we have a required annual standard simple certification that's shared by all social media platforms. The certification would have the person take a "Can you spot the fake post?" and "Can you spot the fake news?" test, similar to the study that Pennycooks describes. Obviously, if we were to establish this kind and require certification, we would start to see herd immunity as a shift towards rejecting blatantly false news with large swaths of the population. I like the graphic here from the World Health Organization page about Infodemic, where they show how an inoculated population would trim down the spread of misinformation by not forwarding it. Without the trimming, this tree grows, as we discussed earlier, 3 to the power of n-1. As we can see, that with trimming, its growth is significantly suppressed. Now, obviously, a proposal like this will encounter opposition. Opponents will cite free speech infringement, that their First Amendment rights are being violated. Front groups and other bad players can be expected to make arguments about unreasonable costs and bloated government overreach and privacy, etc. But I'd like to point out that in America, we accept certain behaviors as requiring the user to be registered or licensed. For example, people have to have a driver's license and insurance to drive a car, and the car has to be registered. We accept this as good for society, even if, in the case of for drivers, it has questionable optics on the social classes and could be construed as impinging certain basic rights. Before we were to implement something like this, we need to consider how bad players might try to use it for their own ends, politically or economically. And we also need to consider what might be the outcome of incompetent use of the tools and what some unintended consequences be. For instance, could this or would this cause a centralization of news authorities where small and independent news sources get squeezed out? Clearly, there's a lot to think about and getting clear on before we could implement a proposal like this. But as they say, failing to plan is planning to fail. We need to get intentional about fighting misinformation. The negative effects of fake news and misinformation are increasingly making it clear that we need to do something. In this talk, I proposed that we should adopt a infodemic mindset, a series of steps which makes us all stakeholders rather than giving government and social media companies all the responsibility and hence all the power. As we do this, we will need the ability to be flexible and grow and adjust, reacting to unintended consequences and adapting to inevitable changes in technology. So I hope you found this talk interesting and it sparked some new thoughts about how we can address the problem of misinformation in America. I would like to thank Dr. Greg Longo for this and the other many classes that I've had with him. I'd also like to thank the class GAs and other students I've interacted with this semester and throughout this year in this class and others. It's been quite a learning experience. Thank you.